The clanking of chains echoed through the damp corridors of the prison of Carthage as two women were dragged into the deepest dungeons of the Roman Empire. One was a noblewoman, the other a slave. One clutched a newborn, the other carried a child in her womb. Both shared something that Romans considered more dangerous than any weapon: Christian faith. In the year 203 AD, Perpetua and Felicitas would face one of the most brutal punishments ever conceived by the human mind. A horror that would unfold for hours under the scorching sun of Carthage, in front of thousands of bloodthirsting spectators. Their story is not simply an account of extreme suffering, but a testimony of the indestructible power of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable cruelty. In the 3rd century, North Africa was a hotbed of religious and social tensions. Carthage, former rival of Rome, had become one of the most prosperous cities in the empire, but also one of the most restless. The Christian community was growing rapidly among all social classes, from slaves to nobility, challenging the religious and political foundations of Roman power. The emperor himself, Septimius Severus, born in Africa, knew well the dangers of this new religion that preached loyalty to a heavenly king above the earthly emperor. During his reign, persecutions intensified throughout the Roman world, probably encouraged by regional governors who wished to demonstrate their loyalty to the emperor through the suppression of Christians. Vibia Perpetua was born into the aristocracy of Carthage, daughter of one of the most influential families in the region. At 22 years old, she was a young mother who had just given birth to a child and enjoyed all the privileges that her social position could offer. Educated according to the best Roman traditions, she spoke fluent Latin and Greek, knew classical literature, and had been raised to assume the role of a respectable matron of society. However, something in her young heart yearned for a meaning greater than the conventions of her time. When she encountered the Christian community, she found the answers she was looking for. Felicitas represented the extreme opposite of the Roman social pyramid. As a slave in a household, she possessed no legal rights or prospects of freedom. At 20 years old, she was 8 months pregnant when the events that would change her life forever began. Despite her condition of servitude, she possessed a sharp intelligence and an indomitable spirit that impressed all those around her. When Christian teaching arrived at Perpetua's household, Felicitas embraced it with a passion that rivaled even her mistress, finding in the new faith a dignity that Roman society had never offered her. Conversion to Christianity at that time was not a simple or rapid process. Future Christians were subjected to a long period of preparation called the catechumenate, during which they studied scriptures, learned the foundations of faith, and prepared for baptism. Perpetua and Felicitas were catechumens. They had not yet been officially baptized, though it is possible they received baptism while already in prison. Together with them, other young people shared the same journey. Saturninus, Secundulus, Revocatus, and their catechist Satyrus, who had become a spiritual guide for the group. The arrest happened suddenly and violently one morning, in March of the year 203 AD. Roman soldiers invaded the residences where the catechumens met, tearing them from their beds and brutally separating them from their families. Local persecutions were carried out with implacable severity, and provincial governors competed to demonstrate their loyalty to the emperor through the repression of Christians. Perpetua was torn from the arms of her nursing child, while Felicitas, in an advanced state of pregnancy, was pushed and dragged by the soldiers who took her to prison. The conditions in the prison of Carthage were deliberately inhuman. The Christians were thrown into an underground cell, where darkness was total and air was barely breathable. Dozens of prisoners were crammed into a space meant for few, without adequate ventilation, sanitation, or privacy. The heat was suffocating during the day, and cold penetrated at night. Food consisted of spoiled scraps thrown on the ground, and water was rationed to the point of causing continuous dehydration. Many prisoners died before even reaching trial, which was exactly the intention of the authorities. It was in this infernal environment that Perpetua began to write her diary. One of the most extraordinary documents of Christian literature, and one of the first known writings by a woman in Western history. With a courage that challenges modern imagination, she recorded not only the physical horrors she faced, but also her mystical visions and the spiritual transformation she experienced. Her words, passed down through the centuries, offer a unique window into the mind of a woman who faced the most atrocious death for her convictions. Perpetua's father, a pagan who loved her deeply, made multiple desperate attempts to save her. He repeatedly visited her in prison, begging her to renounce Christianity and save not only her life, but also the honor of the family. In a particularly touching scene recorded in her diary, he threw himself at her feet, calling her daughter instead of lady, a radical change in social roles that demonstrated the desperation of a father who saw his daughter choose death. Perpetua, with a broken heart but an unbreakable will, consistently refused his request, explaining that she could not deny her faith even to save her own life. Meanwhile, Felicitas had to face a different anguish. According to Roman law, pregnant women could not be executed before giving birth. This meant that if she had not given birth before the date set for the public games, she would be separated from her companions of faith and executed alone afterwards. For a woman who had found a spiritual family among the catechumens, the prospect of dying alone was almost unbearable. The entire group gathered in fervent prayer, asking that she give birth in time to share martyrdom with her brothers in faith. The answer arrived dramatically. Felicitas went into labor only 2 days before the date set for execution. The pains were agonizing, intensified by malnutrition, dehydration, and extreme emotional stress. During the birth, her cries of agony echoed through the prison. In sadistic guard mocked her. "If you scream like this now, what will you do when you face the animals in the amphitheater?" The response of Felicitas, recorded by companions who witnessed the scene, became one of the most powerful statements of Christian martyrdom. "Now it is I who suffers, but out there another will be in me and will suffer for me, because I will suffer for him." The trial was a judicial farce that lasted only a few hours. The prosecutor, Hilarianus, representing imperial authority, offered the prisoners one last chance to save their lives by sacrificing to the Roman gods. One by one, they categorically refused. When it was Perpetua's turn, the magistrate specifically appealed to her maternal feelings, reminding her that her child would be orphaned. Her answer was simple and definitive: "I will not sacrifice." With those words, she not only sealed her destiny, but also demonstrated a strength of character that impressed even her enemies. The sentence was pronounced with theatrical solemnity. The Christians were to be exposed to fierce beasts during the public games that celebrated the birthday of Geta, son of Emperor Septimius Severus. This was not a simple execution, but a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to humiliate the condemned and terrorize anyone who sympathized with Christianity. The games would last all day, and several animals would be released against the prisoners in successive waves, deliberately prolonging the suffering to maximize the entertainment of the crowd. On March 7th, 203 AD, the sky was clear and warm over Carthage. The crowd gathered in the amphitheater from the early hours, eager to watch the show. Walking vendors offered food and drinks. Gamblers made their predictions on how long each prisoner would last, and the crowds were driven by the morbid curiosity that characterized Roman spectacles. The amphitheater, which could hold tens of thousands of spectators, perhaps up to 25,000 people, was completely packed, including local authorities, wealthy merchants, and ordinary citizens, all united by the same thirst for violence. When the prisoners were led into the arena, there was a remarkable scene. Instead of the terror and despair that the crowd expected to see, the Christians entered singing hymns and with expressions of serenity on their faces. Perpetua in particular radiated a confidence that confused the spectators. They refused to wear the ritual garments that were imposed on the condemned, tunics dedicated to pagan deities, declaring that they had made a pact with the authorities to die as Christians and not as pagans. The horror unfolded gradually following the macabre choreography typical of Roman games. First, the men were exposed to the beasts. A wild boar was released against Revocatus and Saturninus, then bears and leopards. The animals, deliberately deprived of food to increase their aggressiveness, attacked with brutal ferocity. According to witnesses, before being led into the arena, Satyrus prophesied the exact manner of his death. The roars of the animals mixed with the screams of the crowd, creating a cacophony of violence that reverberated through the stone walls of the amphitheater. For the women, The organizers of the show reserved a particular cruelty. Against Perpetua and Felicitas, a wild cow was released, chosen specifically for its symbolism. The animal, confused and infuriated by the crowd's noise, attacked Perpetua first, goring her and violently throwing her into the air. She fell violently on her back with brutal impact, but immediately got up and adjusted her clothing to maintain decency, demonstrating a remarkable presence of mind in the midst of chaos. When she saw Felicitas fallen and injured, she ran to help her stand, demonstrating solidarity and love even in their last moments. The crowd, initially thirsty for blood, began to be troubled by the extraordinary dignity of the two women. Instead of begging for mercy or showing terror, they held each other and continued to pray aloud. Some spectators began to murmur in dismay, involuntarily touched by the courage they were witnessing. Rome intended to paint Christians as cowards and traitors, but the spectacle was producing the opposite effect. When it became clear that the animals would not complete the work quickly, the organizers decided to accelerate the end. The condemned were led to the center of the arena to receive the coup de grace from the gladiators. But even in this supreme moment, the Christians maintained their extraordinary composure. They embraced each other with the traditional kiss of peace and calmly prepared to receive death. Felicitas was the first to be beheaded. The expert gladiator performed the blow with professional precision, and she died instantly. Perpetua, on the other hand, was less fortunate. The gladiator assigned to execute her was nervous and inexperienced. His first blow missed the target, striking her between the collarbones. Perpetua screamed in pain, the first sound of suffering she had uttered during the entire ordeal. But then, in one last demonstration of control over her own destiny, she guided the trembling hand of the young gladiator to the correct position on her neck, helping him complete the execution. The impact of Perpetua's and Felicitas's martyrdom resonated far beyond the walls of the Carthaginian amphitheater. Their death did not produce the intimidating effect that Roman authorities expected. On the contrary, their example of courage inspired countless conversions to Christianity throughout Roman Africa and beyond. Perpetua's diary, preserved and copied by admiring Christians, became one of the most influential texts of primitive Christianity, read in Christian communities from Spain to Syria. The brutality of the punishment inflicted on these two young women, a noble mother and a pregnant slave, laid bare the barbaric nature of a system that confused entertainment with extermination. Even by Roman standards, accustomed to the violence of gladiatorial games, the spectacle was exceptionally cruel. The choice to expose women to wild animals, to deliberately prolong their sufferings, and to force them to die as a public show represented one of the lowest points of Roman civilization. More than 1800 years later, the words of Perpetua still possess extraordinary power. Her diary offers a unique window into the mind of a woman who faced the most terrible death for her convictions. Her refusal to sacrifice her principles, even in the face of torture and death, established a standard of moral courage that continues to inspire people of all religions and cultures. The history of Perpetua and Felicitas reminds us that the true measure of a civilization is not in its monuments or its conquests, but in the way it treats its most vulnerable and in its tolerance toward those who think differently. The martyrdom of these two extraordinary women remains an eternal testimony to humanity's ability to transcend fear, pain, and even death when guided by deep conviction and true love. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe. Share with those who love history. Thank you for listening. See you next time.